All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Dear Editor. This is an ongoing educational series from the Research Medical Library where we discuss topics on scientific writing and publishing. And after today's session, as always, we will share a copy of the slides, and we also have a handout for you with some additional resources that are related to today's topic. And we are, again, recording today's session, and we'll send you out a link to the recording as well as copies of the slides in the handout. If you are interested in looking at previous Dear Editor sessions, you can access the slides and the handouts and recordings if you join the Dear Editor team, which you see on the slide in front of you and also is in the handout as well. My name is Erica Goodoff, and joining me today is Stephanie Deming, and we are senior scientific editors in the Research Medical Library. And this morning we're going to be discussing some ways that you can improve the readability of your paper, ways to make it easier for reviewers and readers to understand your paper when you just have a couple of, I don't know, maybe a couple of hours or so to revise your paper and you kind of need to just get it out the door. Some things that can kind of maximize the amount of time that you have left and aren't terribly intense things that you can do to help improve your paper. So, okay. So here's kind of an overview of some of the things that we're going to talk about. We're going to discuss briefly some Microsoft Word tools that you can use that are things you can run in a couple of minutes. We're also going to talk about how to make sure that the main messages in your paper are consistent. Something that sounds like a lot, but you can check this in a couple of quick ways. I'm also going to talk about ways to make sure that information between sections of your paper is consistent and in agreement. Something that seems like details, but can really confuse a reader if it's too far off the mark. So it's worth taking a look at if you just have a little bit of time left. And also we're going to look at some things that might appear in the journal author instructions that are worth kind of going over sort of checklist style when you're just kind of getting ready to finish up. So with that in mind, I do want to start though by talking about things that you really cannot fix with a last minute quick check. These are issues where if you're starting to work on your paper and you start encountering these things, you're probably going to need more than a couple of hours to fix them. These get a little bit more in depth, more revision needed. So at this point in the process, if you're getting ready to submit your paper pretty soon, everybody who qualifies to be an author should be listed in the byline, and the author byline shouldn't include anyone who doesn't qualify for authorship. And they should be in the order that you've all agreed to. If these are things that you're still not so sure about, you're probably going to have a conversation with your co-authors to work it out. And it can be a real problem to fix this once it's already submitted to a journal. Similarly, at this point in the process, I presumably had some conversations with your co-authors about what results you want to present and what those results mean and sort of the main takeaway messages of your paper. Um, and along with that, the format of your paper should be something that's appropriate for the target journal and more or less in the form that it's supposed to be. Journals maybe aren't terribly picky anymore about oh, it has to have this many words in this section and this many in that section. But for instance, if the journal wants your methods section to appear after your introduction and before your results, and you have it at the end of the paper, that might take a little bit more revision than you can do just last minute in a couple of hours. So that sort of thing, you'll probably want to have that worked out before you get to this point. Um, and lastly, you want to not have any inappropriate reuse of text. And by this, I mean if you've run, say, an authenticate report and it's flagged a bunch of text as previously published, that might take some consideration and it may take some revision that's going to take a little bit more thought and effort. So that's not something you want to run across at the last minute. And if you're wondering what authenticate is or have never used it, we do have a session of Dear Editor next month that covers specifically that topic, how to review those authenticate reports and what is considered an inappropriate reuse of text. So if that's something you have a lot of questions about, make sure you stay tuned. We'll be talking about that in more depth next month. But at this point, presumably you've got all of these things worked out and you're wanting to just finish up this paper and get it on its way. So let's talk about some things that you might consider focusing on when you get to that stage of working on your paper. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie.
Thanks, Erica. So Because Erica and I are editors, we would encourage you to send your manuscripts to our group, which is Editing Services in the Research Medical Library, for a free professional edit. But we understand that there's not always time for that. And when you don't have time, Microsoft Word offers some tools that you might find helpful. So using Word's spelling checker is a really efficient way to catch spelling errors, and it's well worth the time that it takes. So that's one thing you can do to polish your paper. The grammar checker is not as robust as the spelling checker, but it's still decent. So if you have used the grammar checker and you find it helpful, you might consider running that. And then if you would like to check just a small part of your paper, you might consider using the read aloud function of Word, because sometimes hearing the text out loud will help you figure out where the problems lie. And if you want to use the read aloud function, you put your cursor in the manuscript in front of the text that you want Word to read, and then you click the read aloud button on the review tab, and Word will read your paper aloud. And you can adjust the speed, you can change the voice. I also want to mention that when you're using the spelling and grammar checker, you can tell Word to only spell check or only grammar check part of your document. That's really handy. And the way you do that is you select the text that you want it to check, and then you right click with your mouse, and in the little menu that pops up, you choose Review Selection in Editor. And that way, Word will limit its checking to just the passage that you've indicated. All right, next slide.
Yeah. Oh, I wanted to point out we did a session last month at Dear Editor that demoed these couple of features and also some ways for you to help make them work better for you. So if this is something you want to know more information about, check out the team. We've got the whole recording and everything on there for you. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. Before you submit your manuscript to the journal, as Erica mentioned earlier, you want to make sure that the main messages are consistent throughout. Because when the main messages aren't consistent in how they're worded, it can throw the reviewers off and it can be, frustrating and tiring. So you want to have all the ducks in a row. You don't want to have any outlier ducks like this cute little guy off to the right in the slide here. Next slide. So first, I would say make sure that the title accurately conveys the contents of the paper. You want the reviewers to start off with a clear understanding of what your paper is about. So how do you do that? Well, you make the title as informative as possible within any limits that are imposed by the journal. So journals will commonly limit the number of words in the title or the number of characters. Some journals will also prohibit titles that are phrased as sentences or titles that reveal the conclusions. I wish journals wouldn't do that, but you've got to go along with their requirements. But within whatever limits they have, you want to give as much information as possible within the title so that after they read just that part of the paper, the reviewers are already sort of set up with a good understanding of what to expect. Next slide. Next, make sure that the purpose statement or the hypothesis statement in the introduction section of the paper matches the conclusions or the main findings that appear at the beginning of the discussion. So it's usually possible to think of the purpose or hypothesis statement at the beginning as a question that you're trying to answer. And at the beginning of the discussion, readers should find the answer to that question. If they find an answer to a different question, they're going to be confused. And we sometimes see this in papers that are reporting the results of a chart review where maybe somebody has gone back and pulled records from 50 patients who had an unusual disease, and they've written a paper about what they found. And there will be a mismatch between what the introduction suggests the paper was about and what the sort of conclusions or the main messages highlighted at the beginning of the discussion are. And this mismatch doesn't mean there was anything wrong with the study. The study was fine, but just the emphasis doesn't match. And so usually that's not a study problem, that's just a how the study was described problem, and you can fix it by just rewording either the introduction or the discussion so that they match better. Okay, next slide. Another thing to check is consistency between the abstract and the main text. And sometimes these can get out of whack if the abstract was written first, for example, because you presented your findings at a conference before you wrote the rest of the paper. So it's always a good idea as a last step to make sure that the abstract and the main text line up in terms of the purpose statement or the hypothesis statement and the conclusions. And also, if you have time, it's a good idea to just, put the abstract and the main text side by side on your screen or on two different screens and just go back and forth and make sure that all the key details in the abstract match the ones in the main text. Next slide. And finally, you want to make sure that key terms are consistent throughout the manuscript. Next slide. So for example, suppose you're writing about squamous cell carcinoma of the lung, which is a subtype of non-small cell lung cancer, and you write a passage like this. This treatment has produced promising results in patients with squamous cell carcinoma of the lung. For example, in patients with NSCLC and in patients with lung cancer. So if people are reading this, when they get to NSCLC and lung cancer, they might wonder, do you really mean those groups, or do you mean specifically the patients with squamous cell carcinoma? So if you really mean the patients with squamous cell carcinoma, it's better to say that. And you could set up the abbreviation SCC of the lung so that you didn't have to keep repeating a really long term over and over. All right, back to you, Erica.
Okay. Yeah, so those are some great points. Those are things that kind of can distract from the overall takeaway message of the paper. I'm going to talk about something kind of similar to that, but at a little bit more of a granular level. So as Stephanie mentioned that sometimes these inconsistencies can crop up if you've revised the paper or you've revised parts of the paper, or maybe you've had you've got several co-authors and you're each working on different parts of the paper. Sometimes things don't always match between sections. So one of the things that can happen is sometimes your data look like they're different between parts of the paper, and you definitely don't want a reviewer to see something like that and get confused or think, uh-oh, what's going on with this? One of the most common places that we see this as editors is between just data that you've reported in the results section and then within your tables. So I've kind of highlighted some places where this might show up. Let's say that early on in the study, you had 100 participants and then some were added, or maybe you ended up excluding a couple of people from your data set. So you end up with these different numbers between parts of your paper. And as a result of that, the percentages here don't quite match up. And so you have these different numbers showing up. And you don't want a reviewer to see something like this and think, wait a minute, what else is, inconsistent and which one is right? This can cause a lot of confusion. Sort of related to that, when you're looking at when you're looking at your figures, especially if you have very complicated figures with a lot of different parts and a lot of things going on, sometimes you can end up with something that looks like this. If you are familiar with the Stroop test, it's a psychological test where they give you a list of colors, but the colors are written in text that's different from the color of the text, and you're supposed to tell what the color of the text is. And it takes extra effort for you to come up with what you're supposed to answer there. So if you have sort of this confusing mess like this, you can slow down the reader's comprehension of what you're presenting and the reviewer's comprehension of what you're presenting. And that's not something you want them to get distracted by when you want to get across the message of your science. And kind of related to that, I threw in this silly example here, the houses go left to right, but the figure legend says it's top to bottom. So maybe at some point that got changed and the legend didn't get updated. There's also an inset and an arrow, and it's not really clear what those are pointing to. So you just want to make sure and review, okay, does this figure legend describe what we ultimately decided we were going to present within the figure itself? And related to that, again, if you have a lot of complicated figures and a lot of places in your text where you're referring to them, you want to make sure that when you're reading through the results section of your text, that each figure and table is mentioned in order and in the appropriate place in the text. So if the text says that figure 2 shows the results of Western blot experiments, you want to make sure figure 2 does actually show Western blot results and not something from some other experiment. So again, the type of thing that can change as you're revising your paper. And reviewers have told us on a number of occasions at previous presentations that we've done of this type that this sort of thing can be really frustrating if you're trying to review a paper and critically evaluate that information that's being presented. So these things seem like details, but they can add up, especially if there's more than one of this type of error in a paper. And you definitely don't want a reviewer getting stuck on that kind of thing. So it's worth taking a look. And speaking of being consistent, the subheadings that you present within a results section can be a good way for a reader to follow along with what you're trying to present here. So you do want to make sure that long passages of text are broken up with subheadings where it's appropriate to do so. Again, the results section, methods section almost always have some sort of subheadings within them. But it's also helpful for a reviewer if there's some consistency among these subheadings. Again, especially if you have complex scientific data and a lot of experiments and a lot of details to present in your results section. It's helpful. A reviewer is going to find it a little easier to follow if your headings are consistent. Those subheadings are consistent within the section. So if you have, a long a sentence, a complete sentence for your first one, but then they get down to the second subsection and it's this brief, just kind of vague description of what's in there. And it's capitalized, and the other one was not capitalized. These seem like small details, but it can be a little bit confusing. And the reader might be thinking, well, wait a minute, is this the same level of subsection? Is this still referring to something that was presented in the last subsection? So it gets a little bit harder to follow. So to the extent where it's appropriate, you kind of want the subheadings within a main section to be parallel in wording and structure. And along these lines, the same applies to the style of the way that you've put your table titles or your figure legends. There's almost an infinite number of ways you can style these things, and it's somewhat arbitrary. So unless the journal tells you specifically, oh, it needs to be boldface, so it needs to be italic, most of them actually aren't even that granular anymore. But what you really want to make sure is that it's consistent. Because if it looks like it was done by several different people, again, that can sort of confuse a reader, can make them focus on things you don't want them to focus on instead of looking at the content of your document. Same goes for figure legends, just like with tables. It's good to keep them consistent. And I'll add to this as well. If you have those long, like sentence long type subheadings within your results section, and you have a lot of complicated figures, what I often see and what makes it very easy to follow as a reader is there will be consistency between those subheadings within the results, those sentence long subheadings, and then the title on the figure. So kind of in the example here, this first one's a very brief title, but if you can sort of see, oh, okay, we're talking about results of these experiments. That's probably going to go with what's in subsection 1 in the results, and it's easier for a reader to follow along. And here also, the letter parts are kind of inconsistent between the two, and just like I was saying a minute ago, there's a lot of different ways to do it. Pick one. That's all we're saying here. All right. So that's some things to think about if you want to make things consistent. Things, again, that sound like details. If you have one error, no, they're probably not going to reject your paper. But if there's a bunch of these sort of things, that can really distract from what you're trying to do with the paper. Okay, I'll turn this back over to Stephanie.
Thanks, Erica. So as a final check, just for the last few minutes that you have left before you submit, make sure that your manuscript complies with the journal's instructions regarding required statements, file types, location of tables and figures, and reference format. So required statements are things like statements about IRB approval and informed consent. If you were doing a study that involved human subjects, it's easy to forget to put those statements in. Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee approval if you were working with animals. Data sharing, a lot of publishers now ask people to say, are you willing to share your data and under what circumstances and with what limitations? Statements about funding for the study, any potential conflicts of interest on the part of the authors, and then also some journals now want to have details about authors' contributions, who did what, contributing to the work that you're writing about. For file types, some journals will specify, for example, that the manuscript can't be submitted as a PDF. It needs to be submitted as some kind of like a Microsoft Word document, something that's editable by a text editor. Or they may say that you cannot submit tables in Excel format. So just pay attention to that. And then also most journals will specify where the tables and figures should be, either right after the discussion section or at the very end of the manuscript, sometimes in a separate document from the main text. And more I'm seeing that journals will say, at the time of initial submission of your manuscript, go ahead and place each table and figure within the main text immediately after the paragraph in which it was first mentioned. And they do that just to cut down on the amount of flipping back and forth that the peer reviewers have to do. And then finally, just note if the journal has strict requirements about references, and if they do, if you've used reference management software like EndNote, it should be just a matter of minutes to fix the format. A lot of journals don't really care at the time of initial submission what you do, as long as all the references are there and they're understandable.
Okay. All right. So, I mean, these were just some things for you to think about. I'm curious though, we have, 25 minutes or 30 minutes here to talk about some things that you might check at the end of revising your paper. But I would like to know if I can find the poll here. There we go. Um, so there we go. I'm sort of curious to know, are these things that you're checking? And if these are not things that you're checking, um, I would like to hear from you in the chat. What other things are you looking at when you finish up with your paper? Like I said, I don't think we're going to cover absolutely everything you can check, but there's a lot of things that you can do if you have limited time, and these are some suggestions for you if you haven't ever thought about it. But I did include a option on this poll. Oh my gosh, I've never thought about any of it. Hopefully that's not you. um, but let's see. Okay, I've got a few answers here. But is anyone here checking anything else besides these that you think maybe we didn't cover?
Erica, this is Scott. I do want to
Mhm.
say that if you'd only have a couple of hours, it may be worth taking the time to send it to the editing group at the Research Medical Library. Because, again, if you don't have the time to do all these things, it's very likely that an editor can do a lot of these things for you as well. So if you've got you may not have personally a number of hours to work on the paper, but if you can delegate it to somebody in your team, and the turnaround has always been excellent when I've worked with your group. And so if you could wait the week or two to get the feedback back, and then from my experience, 98.7% of the time, the changes that you've made are spot on. And it's taking me a little bit of extra time to find that 1.3% of the times when things are inconsistent. But your group has saved me a lot of work in the past. So I'll make the advertising for your group, and send stuff your way.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for that. And yes, that's absolutely true. There's a difference between there's a strict deadline and you simply don't have the time. And that's a great point. Um, if it's, I can't do it, I don't have the bandwidth for it, maybe your co-author does. And absolutely, we're happy to, that is what we're here for. So thank you very much for that.
Erica, we have a question in the chat. If you're
We
truly up
do.
against a strict deadline and have limited time, do you have a hierarchy of what is most important? I think the main messages are pretty important.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. If you're really there, like keep that basic, keep that big overall takeaway message where it needs to be. That's probably what I would start with too. We kind of did like the importance of things and also things that you can do quickly. So there's kind of both. But I think probably stick with like the really big important message there.
Yeah. Dr. Cantor, do you want to jump in? You have a lot of publishing experience.
Mhm.
What would be top of your hierarchy if you really only have a very limited time?
Great question. I think the instructions to reviewers are really important, at least psychologically, they're really important because you really don't want to mess something up.
Mhm.
There is an expectation from the editor-in-chief of the journal that the directions are being followed. I guess there are some people who, you said that some people don't care what the references look like. I want to make sure that the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed before I submit my paper. So I think following the instructions for reviewers are pretty important in the scheme of things. You don't want to get dinged and say, we're not going to review this because these people ignored our instructions.
Yeah, for sure. And I have seen people not be able to get a manuscript into peer review because the journal said it's too long, for example. Like we said, your paper can only have 3,000 words and it has 3,100. We're not going to look at it. And I was shocked. I thought, oh, come on, 100 out of 3,000 is not a big deal, but sometimes it's really important. Yeah.
Mhm.
And those are the harder decisions sometimes. I remember there was one article that I had submitted where we submitted as a regular article, 3,000 words, and the response was, we were interested in your article, but we want to make it a research brief. And this was like 20 some odd years ago, and I argued a little bit. I said, are you telling me you want me to cut out 2 out of every 3 words to meet the journal requirements? And said yes. And then I was only able to whittle it down to 1,500 words rather than 1,000, and they said, okay, fine, go send it in at that point. But that was like one of the hardest, most painful things I had to do was to cut out stuff that I had already written.
Oh, yeah, that's tough.
Uh,
But I'm going to run to another meeting. Thank you for your
okay.
presentation. Really appreciate it a lot, and I really appreciate all the work that your group does.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you again. Okay, I'll share the results of the poll just because it sounds like these are things that a lot of you are already thinking about when you're writing. Also, we had another comment in the chat. We have a clinical protocol document reviewer. And I want to point out that these are things we focused very much on manuscripts that you're submitting to journals. But these same sort of principles apply to other types of writing. Certainly grant proposals, looking at the overall takeaway message and some of those details can also be good things to check. So this is just sort of a general thing, general set of things that you can look at when you're finishing up writing any type of document. So that goes beyond manuscripts as well. I do want to say that I think we are at the end of our half hour here, so I want to wrap up. So if you have questions, again, feel free to join the team. We're happy to continue the conversation, answer any questions we didn't get a chance to review to answer today. And you can, and again, I will send out a copy of both the slides and handout with some more resources. And make sure if you are interested in learning about Authenticate and text overlap, we will be talking about that at next month's session of Dear Editor.
And Erica, I did put the link to sign up to register for that session in the
Yes.
chat, along with a link to the calendar for the Research Medical Library, where you can learn about Dear Editor and all the other sessions that we do. And then also just contact information for editing services. So if you have a manuscript that's ready for review, I put our email address and then a web page with more information about our services.
All right. Well, great. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat right now. So thank you everybody for joining us today. And as I said, we'll send you some follow-up information afterwards. And otherwise, have a great day.